Hey guys, welcome back to another For Honor Realism analysis. Today we're going to be looking at Highlander, which is the first Viking and non-Knight hero to be reviewed on this channel. I did want to try to finish the Knights faction first, but then they just kept adding more Knights, and I just ended up letting the community decide. After over 4,000 votes in, we have Highlander well in the lead by over 10%, being followed up by Peacekeeper. So, because this is the first Viking hero we have, and especially since it's Highlander, I need to lay out a bit of pre-context before we move into the actual discussion about this hero. When the game was originally played out as Knights, Viking, and Samurai, it may have not been noticed by the average viewer, but this is essentially Europe versus Japan. To try and lay this out on a timeline, we're looking at the, quote, Vikings from the Dark Ages, which is a very broad term which encompasses the fall of the Roman Empire and includes the migration period. These are all terms that aren't very pertinent to the current discussion, but in short, the Dark Ages are the precursor to the medieval era. At some point, they actually blend together quite a bit. For example, the, quote, Viking sword has some things that are relatively similar to a knight's arming sword from the Middle Ages, but you can really see the gap bridged when we put something like the Norman sword in between them, because this Norman sword is really the gray area from where we are exiting the Dark Ages and entering the Middle Ages. We can see that the technologies and logics are still being used and being transitioned over the years. I'm bringing this up because I want to put the concept of Vikings and Knights into perspective and show that they aren't very much different. They are literally from the same geographical location. All that changes is the cultural period and era that we are considering. Why am I explaining all of this in particular? Well, unfortunately for this game, there are exceptions to this timeline. For example, in the Knights, in most cases we have heroes that can be placed somewhere in the medieval period. Even if some were much later in the era, they are still technically a part of it. That being said, there are two outliers in the faction, that being Gladiator and Centurion. I've brought it up in my analysis for both of them, but to really understand how far behind they are both at the peak of the Roman Empire, which, like I said, existed before the beginning of the Dark Ages, since the fall of the Roman Empire is actually one of the catalysts for the Dark Ages. This isn't the only case of this either, which brings us to our hero of our current discussion, Highlander. Highlander here is a mix of a lot of different things. To start, he obviously takes a lot of inspiration from Scottish Highlands with his attire, mostly his kilt. This would set him somewhere in the 15th century to 20th century. Although I don't think that he is anywhere near the 20th century, with this time frame in mind, he's still in the Middle Ages at best. Why Ubisoft put medieval Scots in the Vikings and ancient Romans in the Knights is beyond me. For all I know, Ubisoft could be planning on adding an Imperial Japanese soldier with a bolt-action Arisaka rifle fixed with a bayonet. Timelines mean nothing in this world. All of that aside, Highlander here isn't solely based on the Scottish Highlanders, or at least from what I believe. Now, we're going to have to discuss Highlander's, quote, Claymore. I know that true Claymores are actually more or less Scottish basket-hilt broadswords. For simplicity, I'm going to be referring to the Scottish two-handed sword as a Claymore. If you need more explaining about what I'm talking about, go watch Skolagrim's video on the Claymore and Scottish basket-hilt broadsword. For the Highlander's Claymore, let's start with the fact that realistically, it isn't the proper size for a Claymore. Most Scottish two-handed swords average out around 150 centimeters or 55 inches. This is relatively the length of a longsword that is on the longer end of the spectrum. Just like longswords, there are exceptions. Apparently, there is a claymore that is 2.24 meters long called Feldtjachmurt. I could not find any information on this sword, and the museum that has this sword seems to not have it on display, and it is not on their online exhibit. That being said, it appears to be coming in at 10 kilograms or 22.05 pounds. I very much doubt that a sword this heavy was ever even used as an actual battlefield weapon. So our sword in-game isn't what you would consider a claymore, since it's about the size of a greatsword, and I don't particularly see any resemblance of a Highlander being a German Zweihander user or a Montante or Spadona user at that. We need something that we can relatively ground him with to his Scottish roots, and I think I have the answer. Kind of. It's the closest we're going to get, so work with me here. Introducing the Gallowglass, also known as the Gallowglaig in Irish. Why Irish, you might say? Well, to make a very long story ridiculously short, sometime during the 16th century, there were Scottish mercenaries of Nordic descent that ended up in Ireland looking for work. That summary omitted so much information, so if you really care enough, I suggest taking the time to learn about the Gallowglass yourself. It is a very interesting subject. As we can see, now that we are much further in the medieval period, arguably exiting this period at the point of the 16th century, metallurgy has come much further than before. In this artistic depiction, we can see some kerns with a Gallowglass soldier, and you can see that his sword is massive. I will probably come back to the Kerns and their attire and even more Gallowglass info in the next video, maybe. But again, let's just stick to the sword for the sake of brevity. Now, although the sword is an artistic depiction, and we don't have many, if any at all, surviving examples to corroborate this depiction of this kind of sword, it is generally believed to be plausible considering the time period. So now that we've made a plausible excuse for Mr. Buns and Thigh's comically large sword here, are there any that are pretty well made either historically or practically? Short answer, yes. Long answer is that there is a mixed bag of great, good, and acceptable. Some things that I would mention if it were on other heroes I won't mention here because we have just so much to work with and I want to keep the video short-ish. Also, try to remember what the Gallowglass sword looks like. It could be useful later. Anyways, let's get started, tip to butt like we always do, starting with the blades of the sword. We're just going to rapid fire through as many as we can. To start, we have the Hardy blade. Single floor blade, real simple. I like it. Stupid thick though, but this is a common theme when we saw Warden's blades as well. That ended up being remedied with Warmonger. Next, we have the Defender blade, no fuller with the diamond cross section. Really simple, which usually means that it gets mentioned here. Can't complain. Next, we have the Highlander blade. It's like the Defender blade, but if the user put in some fucking work with it. This dude straight parries. I actually like this one a bit because it shows two things. First, it shows that the sword is made out of a softer material, which means although it is hardenable, it still has the ability to get scraped or dented, which is quite accurate to swords back then. We really take modern metallurgy for granted nowadays. Second, it shows that there are numerous impacts on the flat of the blade. I like this because it shows that if someone were chopping at them with their sword or axe, he would parry with the flat to avoid edge damage. If you are in HEMA, you have probably heard the flat versus edge parry discussion at least once in your life. Honestly, both sides are valid and not the time to go into that discussion here. I just think it's neat. Next, we have the Lowlands blade, a little more flat side damage, which is neat. What looks like two thin fullers on the flat as well. This one is pretty solid. Next, we probably have the best blade at your disposal, and I'm not being ironic here, it's the Dunmaglass blade. Putting the name aside, it is the only blade here that is simple and of reasonable thickness. This would probably be the blade that I would choose out of all of them. It also has a pretty good design with a single shallow fuller going up to about the mid-length of the blade. Next, we have the Summerlib blade. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with the leaf-shaped blade. We've seen this before in the Mainz pattern of gladius that Roman legionaries have used, and those swords conquered the Western world. But there is a problem with it being this large of size. The narrowest part of the blade is one of the weakest points because it has less material. The furthest down the blade is where the most shock and vibration from impacts are also going to go. Combining these two together with a lot of mass, which means a lot of force, which means a lot of vibrations, is essentially setting the sword up for a failure point. And if there were any point that I would want a sword to snap at, it would definitely not be at the crossguard area. Next, we have the Fion blade, and it is a similar issue with the previous blade towards the Ricasso. That being said, it seems to be much smaller, and considering this is one of the thinner blades, I can almost give it a pass. Almost. Next, we have the Fetlar blade. This one is simple in design with a single edge bevel, which is always nice to see. The most eye-catching feature of this one is the brass inlay in the fuller. This is interesting and also plausible. I don't know if someone would want to do that to something like this sword as they were planning on using it in combat, but someone could definitely do something like this as a status symbol. Last one we're going to be looking at is the Seahorse blade. I know there are more blades that I could have looked at, but we must be moving on. This one is interesting with the slight flared out Ricasso, but what's more interesting is the pattern welded design, or Damascus design as some might call it. This technique was used and is still used today to create a hybrid of steel to make a much stronger and solid steel. Most people don't use it for that purpose today as it's not really needed, but it was used as far back as the Dark Ages. Regardless, it's neat to see a blade like this. Now that we can move on to the crossguards, before I start looking at the in-game crossguards, let's quickly look at an iconic Scottish Claymore crossguard. One with the most famous Claymore crossguards we've seen on these swords is called the Quatrefoil. This part of a Claymore is so iconic that even if shown to someone who only has a mild knowledge of swords would know what a Claymore is. This then begs the question, if such an iconic feature, why did the developers of this game not add it as one of the options for their in-game Claymore? The closest we get to it is in here, the Hardy Guard D. The Hardy Guard resembles a Claymore crossguard to some extent. It has the bar running up the center of the fuller on the blade, similar to that of a Claymore. Each quillon on the guard is upswept like a Claymore's, but when it comes to the actual foils themselves, they are boxed off and there are only 3 cutouts. Mind you, this is the closest we get to a Claymore crossguard. There is nothing better than this. Very unfortunate for people who want to make a Scottish Claymore build. Next, we have the Bronhar and the Brondguard. Both of these are very similar in shape and size. The only difference is that one appears to be made out of bronze. Bronze for weapons and fittings is mostly phased out by this point, and is extremely likely that a sword guard for a sword of this size would be made out of steel. When looking at the steel one, we can see that they use team colors in-game and is painted on the quillons. Paint on armor I have heard of, but paint on swords I have not. I wouldn't really see why you would paint a sword, especially since it even shows in-game that it was just going to wear off and looked all chipped. Just my opinion on that though. Otherwise, it's a pretty decent shaped guard. Next up, we have the Defender guard. Ah, yes, finally, the single foil. Motherfuckers took my 3 other foils, can't have shit in Detroit. All joking aside, this guard looks really well put together, and it is quite plausible as a guard. I feel like I've even seen it as a museum piece with this guard, but I can't remember, and I can't be bothered to look it up. Moving on. Next, we have the Highlands guard. This one is very interesting to me because it reminds me of what I can only call as a Danish longsword with their crescent guards. They are quite long longswords though, with the longest one of these finds coming in at around 144 centimeters. That's almost 5 feet long. Definitely a fitting guard for swords like these in game, considering their length. I don't know exactly how you would connect the Danes to Scotland or Ireland, but it's cool, so who cares. Next, we have the Lowlands guard, and the amount of rust on this brings me pain. I physically don't have the energy to go into my too much rust rant, but longtime viewers already know what's going on. Just picture me doing that rant in your head. Other than that, it appears to be quite bulky, but that doesn't make it inherently bad. Overall, it's okay, but there are better. Next, and again, unironically one of the best, we have the Dunmaglass guard. Hold on, I have an explanation for this too, but I don't want to tell you yet. Just wait, I swear I will come back to this one, I promise. Next, we have the Buxus guard. This guard just looks so simple that I can't help but love it. It almost has a penny scroll thing going on with its quillons, but not really. Overall, pretty okay crossguard. Next, I just want to say to Ubisoft that your Geimhred guard and your Erach guard are the same, but your Geimhred guard clips through the sword. You should probably fix that. Next, the Erach guard, not to be confused with the Erach guard, has 4 penny scrolls and is similar to different Zweihander guards that we have seen before. We talked about this a bit in my Warmonger analysis if you'd like to see more on those. Regardless, this looks like it would work well for a Zweihander build. It also comes in green. That pretty much sums up guards. Now let's talk about the hilt, or what is actually known as the grip and pommel. There are a lot of good hilt options. Let's start with the one that's a little lackluster, the default Hardy hilt. No sort of wrap on the grip, a relatively small pommel for a large sized sword, and there's a weird metal beam that goes down the center of the grip on each side. It just seems poor compared to the other ones we will see in a bit. Next, we have the Defender hilt, and it literally has surpassed the previous ones on every level. It is still a bare wood grip, but at least it doesn't look as bad as the previous one. It also has a wheel pommel, which was quite frequently used in the medieval period, and it has a simple metal band in the center, which is much less obtrusive than a large metal bar that scales the entire length of the handle. This is a hilt that I would consider using. Next, we have the Highlands hilt, and this is what I would say would be the closest to having a Scottish Claymore hilt in the game. The handle itself I don't have any particular issue with, except whatever that metal showing through is, but the pommel itself is a bit strange. I don't know exactly what it is, some sort of beehive, honeycomb, butt plug looking thing. Either way, I'd say it's the closest to a Claymore since that sword is known for having a rounded ball-like pommel. There are literally 0 ball-shaped pommels on reasonable looking hilts, so this is the one we'll be working with. Next, and bear with me on this one, we had the Lowlands hilt, the Fionn Lowlands hilt, and the Branar hilt. Ubisoft made this one hilt and said, hey, wait a minute, this kind of fire though, and then proceeded to make it again 2 times. Out of all of them, the one I would say is the most effective is the Lowlands hilt, so let's work with that one. It has a small pommel as well, but it has a nice leather wrap on the grip, which is very important from keeping the wood underneath from splitting or rotting. It also has a pretty smooth grip with no intrusions, so this one is okay in my book. Next, and I know you're probably expecting it at this point, one of the best hilts, the Dunmaglass hilt. Now let me explain why this hilt is great and why the guard is also great, particularly when paired with this hilt. Does this pommel look familiar to you? Well, if you said The Witcher 3 and Ciri's sword, you'd be correct, but that's not the answer I was going for. If you said that this is the same pommel we saw at the depiction of the Gallaglass sword, you would be correct. Pat yourself on the back. With the Dunmaglass hilt, guard, and blade, you make a complete Gallaglass sword. I'll touch on this a bit more when we talk about complete builds at the end. That being said, I think this is fantastic, and definitely what I'm going to be running. Next, we have the Buxus hilt. Buxus hilt, more like Boxus hilt. Okay, you can unsubscribe now. Anyways, I actually like this hilt a bit. The grip is significantly textured, and the pommel is large and seems useful. The only issue I have is whatever those rivets or decorations are on the grip. They seem misplaced, and it looks like it would hurt to wield more than it would help. If it didn't have that, I would say it's usable. Next we have the Braun hilt. This one is odd looking at first, but when looking at the actual components, it's actually pretty good. So we have a leather wrap, a smooth grip, and a large but tapered pommel. This is the kind of grip we would see often on later German and Italian longswords. I would highly suggest this if it weren't for that nasty seafoam green leather. If that's your style though, hey, go for it. Next we have the Erach hilt. I like this one quite a bit because it has a lot of ornate early Renaissance vibes to it. It's also another all-metal hilt, so practically it isn't as good, but it's still neat to look at. Next we have the Summerled hilt, and it's just like the previous one. All metal, but a lot of design choices that look more late medieval, early Renaissance longsword, and nowhere near Claymore-like. That wraps up the hilt section, and now that we've talked about each piece of the sword, let's talk about some of the combinations I would do if I wanted to go for a certain look, and surprisingly, there are a few of them. Let's start with my most favorite build, and you knew I was going to say it, the Dunmaglass build. Now, literally using every single piece of the Dunmaglass set, you get a complete Gallowglass look. Not to mention, you are using the thinnest blade too, which in turn makes it even look more realistic. Next, let's look at the Claymore build. As you can see, this is as close as we can get. To start, you're going to want a competent blade. You could use the Hardy blade to match the set with the guard we're using, but the Dunmaglass blade is almost identical and it just looks better. So I choose that instead. Next, we are using the Hardy guard because it does have the closest thing to a quatrefoil available. Then, for the hilt, you want to go with the closest shape. I would choose the Highlands hilt. If you think that the brass pommel and the steel guard clash a bit, then I would use the Defender hilt with the wheel pommel. Next, as a curveball kind of build, I just wanted to get the closest we could to a sort of Zweihander look. If you have the Soroche blade, you can use that as a sort of flamberge effect, but if you don't have that, then I would use the Salamandra blade if you want to go for that elegant look, and then the Seahorse blade if you want that more toned down look. Then, for the hilt, I would use the Erach hilt because I like the fleur-de-lis shape on the pommel, and I'd use the Erach guard because I want those penny scrolls to make that Zweihander look as well. Now, this isn't close to a historically accurate Zweihander at all, but it is much closer to that than it is a Claymore, at least in this form. Anyways, that's going to be it for this one. We had a lot of information to get through, and there's still heaps we could have talked about. For now, I think we've covered all the important stuff. If you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon. Also, please like the video. It helps get the video to other people. If you don't like the video, Highlander is going to come into your room, and he's going to hit you with the kick into caber toss. You don't want that. You don't want to eat the free heavy. And don't think you can dodge roll. You know there isn't enough space to dodge roll in that bedroom. Anyways, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or Irish/Scottish battle cries you'd like to share, feel free to leave it down below. I'd love to see them. As always, thank you for watching this video, and I will see you next time. Peace.